The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, greetings everybody. This is Allison Flepson, the coordinator of the MTB MLE network. Thank you all for joining us. Good morning to those of you who are in the United States, and good afternoon and to some of you in Europe, and good evening to those of you who are listening in from Africa and some other parts of the world. We're very excited to have this opportunity to have a webinar with people who are all over the world working on behalf of mother tongue-based multilingual education. We have a wonderful speaker today who will be presenting some research as well as her own experiences working on programs that involve mother tongue and multilingual education. I wanted to start off the webinar by first providing just a brief introduction to our network, since we noticed in the registration list that there's many of you who we don't know and who may not know us. We wanted to just share a bit about who we are. The MTB MLE network is an association of organizations and individuals based both in the U.S. and in other parts of the world who are committed to providing education in linguistically and culturally appropriate environments for children. What we do is disseminate resources about mother tongue-based education. We do this through presentations such as this webinar, also the website that we have, and we've also produced a brief providing a comprehensive overview of MTB MLE issues and research. We also do advocacy as appropriate through our own networks, through our own organizations, and through the personal and professional conversations that we have. Anyone is open to join our network. We actually don't keep a membership list per se, but anyone interested in learning about what we do, supporting us, attending events, or contributing is welcome to send us an email at this address listed here, or to visit our website online where you can find a number of resources. You can also submit resources that you have if you'd like to upload documents that you've produced or that are in particular about different projects that you're working on. You can submit those to the website. You can also sign up there to receive different alerts when documents of interest are posted. So if you set a profile for yourself, you'll get automatic updates to tell you to go check something new out there. So that's a bit about who we are. Can we go to the next slide? We'll see a bit about today's event. This is a follow-up activity to a symposium that we held in September to identify ways in which we could better share research of interest to the MTB MLE community. I think a number of you on the line participated in that. We had some presentations by people working in this field to present research in key areas, and we discussed the need for having events and also resources in which people are given an opportunity to share research that is of interest, and also the need to figure out how to gather more research and do some of the research that still needs to be done. So we're in the process of following up on that, and this is one way in which we're trying to disseminate information, and we hope to have future webinars with speakers who have been working in this field and can synthesize a lot of their work and research that's out there. If you'd like to share some of your ideas about what you think our field needs in terms of research, or you'd like to suggest activities and events that would be useful, please go to our website. You'll see there's a Forums tab at the top, and you can select MTB MLE Research Agenda. There's some questions there that we discussed during the previous event, and you can see notes and also add your thoughts there. So a bit about how the webinar works, this particular program GoToWebinar. There's a couple of tips we just wanted to go quickly through to make sure we all have the best experience possible. You should all have selected already the audio mode. If you're calling in through the internet, you're using your mic and speakers as indicated there in the control panel. If you decide to switch to telephone because you're in transit and you're not looking at the internet, you can click on Use Telephone. We do recommend you use a headset so as to minimize the background noise and any kind of interference when you're listening. And just so everyone knows, you will be muted during the webinar because of the large number of attendees that we expect. But there's, we'll go over on the next slide, some options for submitting questions and facilitating discussion. If you see your control panel there, there's an arrow to open and close it if you need to minimize how much space it's taking up on your screen. There's also a field for submitting your questions. If you click send, you can submit the questions to the group or to the presenter, and questions will be answered throughout the presentation. Ágata has built in many points during this presentation to facilitate discussion, so you'll be prompted at different times to send in either questions or to send in brief overview of some of your experience that we can all see. There's also a little hand icon on the left-hand side of your control panel. At certain times you'll be asked questions, and rather than everyone typing answers, you can just raise your hand by clicking on that icon to indicate if you agree or have had a particular experience or whatever the prompt is. There's also some polls that we've built into this presentation, and those will appear when the time comes, and you can click on your chosen response and then submit that. So we hope this is an interactive time, this webinar, and that everyone's able to submit their questions, share their experiences. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Ágata van Gínkel. She works with SIL International out of the Africa area office. She's currently in Kenya, and we're very pleased she was able to get a very good connection this morning or this evening, her time, to share her experience and her knowledge. So since you've all seen her bio, and I know she will also be providing some introduction to herself, I'm going to say thank you very much to Ágata for joining us today and turn the presentation to her.
Thank you, Alison. Well, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where in the world you are. So as Alison said, I'm presenting this webinar from Nairobi in Kenya, and it's already evening here. And we have people from America, Africa, Europe, and Asia. And so that's quite interesting, because I think your questions and responses will be very helpful for all of us. The topic of this webinar is using an additional language as medium of instruction and transitioning in mother tongue-based multilingual education. So I will first introduce myself. Who am I? Well, I'm Ágata van Gínkel, and you probably might have heard that I'm Dutch, and I'm multilingual. And as we are talking about mother tongue-based multilingual education, it's I can tell you that I'm a product of one of those systems, and I've learned my foreign languages at secondary school, but never had a foreign language as a medium of instruction in my own country. I've been working in Africa since 1995, and I've been involved in planning, monitoring, and evaluating mother tongue-based multilingual education programs and literacy programs in several countries in Africa. And currently I'm assisting multilingual projects in about 20 languages in Africa, and my assignment is with SIL International, Africa area, where I'm a senior literacy and education consultant. As I said before, I'm presenting from Nairobi, and every now and then the internet will not cooperate. If that happens, just take the opportunity to discuss some of the things that we have just been looking at, and I will ask Alison to moderate that, and when I'm back online, I can continue with the presentation. So the objectives of this webinar are to be more knowledgeable about evidence-based research regarding how young children learn additional languages in a classroom setting, understand the concept of language threshold and its role in determining when children can use an additional language as a medium of instruction, and understand the most important factors that determine the pace of language learning in a classroom, and be aware of options for language transitions in different contexts. And these objectives, they'll only cover a fraction of all the issues and questions that are there with regard to using an additional language as a medium of instruction. And some of you will know quite a bit about this topic and can probably contribute and give your comments in the section of the questions, and so we can all learn about this topic from each other. So the first question I would like to look at is where in the world does mother tongue-based multilingual education takes place? And I've identified two main scenarios. And the first one is where there is one dominant language in a country, but there is a desire or a need to have multilingual citizens. And this situation occurs in many countries in Europe, but also in Rwanda and Burundi, for example. And in Europe, there is a policy that states that European learners need to become plurilingual and pluricultural. And European countries are fairly successful in mother tongue education, but there are still some challenges in learning and using additional languages very well. And it's worth noting that though the education in most of European countries is delivered through the dominant language, that the education in most European countries is delivered through the dominant language, and the second language is hardly ever used as medium of instruction. The other scenario that you can find around the world is where you have multilingual countries. Like many countries in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, and they often have one or two national languages or languages of wider communication that everyone needs to learn to know. And often this is a language of a colonizer, and often that language is very highly valued. And in multilingual countries, there tends to be a challenge with mother tongue education. And often the majority of the learners also have challenging in acquiring the national languages well enough to function in it. And in these countries, education is often delivered in the second language, and already often starting in primary school, which is a very interesting contrast to what we see in Europe. I would like to talk about two main approaches for mother tongue-based multilingual education. There's of course also the emergent approach, but as that hardly does give any space to mother tongue, I will not discuss it here. We have the transitional approach and the additive approach to multilingual education. And in the transitional approach, the language of the learner is used for some years during primary school, and at some point there is a transition to the national language, of the language of wider communication. This can be gradual or very abrupt from one year to the other. And depending on when the transition takes place, this approach can be successful, but it is often at the expense of the first language and the culture and the linguistic heritage of the learners. And as at some point the first language is no longer a part of the education system anymore. The other system is the additive approach, and the goal is that the learners have a high proficiency level in the first language as well as in the additional language, and the first language of the learners stays part of the education, and the additional languages are learned as subjects, or sometimes they are partly used as medium of instruction. And this approach values the language of the individual, and it respects the individual background, linguistic heritage and culture. Excuse me, I got a cold, There's one more distinction I would like to make that's important for this presentation, and that's the difference between second language or foreign language. And it's defined sometimes slightly differently by people, so I'd like to clarify how I use it in this presentation so we know that we are talking about the same thing. The second language is a language when it's also spoken outside of the classroom. It's a lingua franca in the country. For example, English in India, or Kiswahili, or English in Kenya, Amharic in Ethiopia. And when I talk about a foreign language, it means that the language is not or hardly used outside the classroom. The language input is mainly received during the language learning sessions. And examples of this is for English in Denmark, or French in the UK, However, also for many children in rural settings in, say, Africa or Asia, the second language, or the language that's used as a lingua franca, is basically a foreign language to them, as they do not hear it outside the classroom. And again, example would be Amharic for children in rural Ethiopia, or English for children in rural Ethiopia, or English for children in rural Kenya. This is an important difference when we are thinking about developing curricula for language teaching. Now there is one more thing I would like to look at, is multilingual education. How many languages are we looking at? And that can be different languages. It can just be one additional language, like English in Uganda or Portuguese in Mozambique. It could also be two additional languages, like in Kenya, here they use Kiswahili and English. That's what the children have to learn. Or in Ethiopia, children have to learn Amharic and English. But it can also be three additional languages, like in the Netherlands or other countries in Europe. Children learn English, French, German, and sometimes even some more languages. And when you're thinking about language teaching in the multilingual setting and you have more than one language, you also need to look at if those languages are second language, is it used outside the school, or are they foreign languages? Because that influences again how you look at the curriculum and how you have to develop it. So I'll just take a few minutes to get some questions from you, just to clarify some of the issues. So you can use the question part of the interaction. Let's see if I can see some of you writing questions. Does anyone have any questions? Or you can raise your hand if you have a question, and then type your question in the question box. Otherwise, I'll just move on. Let me see. Can we talk about children coming from chiefly oral cultures? And yes, so how they learn languages. Because when children come from oral cultures, they will have to learn a language. But if it is done directly through literacy, it's of course very difficult for them because they have to learn a lot of things. So I'll talk about young children and language learning a little bit later. So let's see if that question is answered, or we can come back to it at the end. I don't see any other questions coming, so that might be coming in a few minutes, but we'll see. We'll pick them up later on. So I will go back to the next section. Let's see if I can do that. Some assumptions about language learning and young learners. There are some assumptions that people have about language learning and young learners. And when we talk about young learners, we're talking about children between the age between 4 and 12 years old. That's what they call young learners in the literature. And there are two assumptions that prevail. And the first one is the earlier children start to learn a language, the better it is. And the second assumption is the longer children learn a language, the better they learn the language. And I would like to know your opinion or how you view this. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to vote on a poll. And let's see if you can see that. I've now opened a poll for you. I hope you can see it. People are voting. Yeah. Is it true that the younger children start with a language learning, the better it is? 67% now says true, and I'm going to 68. So I see that 80% has voted now. So I'm going to close this poll, and then you can probably view the results as well. So you can see 66% of you says that's true and 34% says that's false. So let's look at the next one, which is the longer children learn a language, the better they will learn a language. Could you also vote on that one? And people are voting. 49% has voted, 51% now, 74, this is nice to see. 79% has voted. 85% of the people have voted. I'm going to close it so that you can also see the results, I think. So we see that 70% of you says that's true and 30% says that's false. So let's let me see what you can see here. Let me walk through some of the research with you, because that's quite interesting. When you go and look at some of the research in that talks about the younger children learn the better, you find some interesting things. The answer is not that straightforward. It's not a completely true or not true. But what research shows is that older learners are faster learners if the exposure is kept constant. So they learn faster than young learners, and this rate advantage is associated with the older starters' advanced cognitive skills. So if they are a little bit older, like about 10 years old, they learn faster than the very young children, and that's because they are cognitively more advanced. The older learners appear to perform better in instructed settings because of their cognitive maturity, while the younger learners tend to do better in the naturalistic settings. However, you have to keep in mind that school is often not a very naturalistic setting, and the exposure to the language is not only to learn the language, but they also have to directly often learn content, which doesn't make it very naturalistic anymore. It depends a little bit how that is done. We can look at it later. The other one is time. When you are in a school setting, there's only a limited amount of time that you can use to teach the language, and that is more favorable for the older starters than the very young starters. Now there are some advantages for the very young learners up to about 10 years old or so. What works well, what they can do well, is they find it much easier to acquire a good command of the sound system of the language and the intonation patterns. They tend to be less language anxious than the older learners. They're not so aware of how they speak or what they do, so they're not so anxious about using the language. They lastly have an intuitive process of early language learning, while later on in education they become more analytical, and the two working together seems that they have more deeply embedded, the second language becomes more deeply embedded, and the positive influence on young learners' general education development is also something to consider. The cognitive and emotional and cultural development is different, and they are much more aware of the multilingual and intercultural identity. There are some key conditions for starting with young learners. You can't just start, and the key conditions depend a little bit on the context, but I list here 4 of them, which research has shown are very important, and that's there need to be intensive interaction in the classroom, and it needs to be at least 45 minutes per day for 5 days a week. The class size should be between 10 to 15 children, and the teacher needs to have a very good command of the language. And if those conditions are not there, then Nikolov, who has done a lot of research on language learning with young learners, even says, like, if any of these requirements are missing, second language instruction should not begin at an early age. A negative experience may harm children's attitude to the target language and language learning in general. And there is also some research that shows that young learners, they start very enthusiastically, but then later on they get bored with language learning. Some advantages of the older learners, say when they're about 10 or a little bit older than 10, they make use of concepts they have learned in the first language, and they can plot a new language on the concepts. And the young learners, or the young learners, also still have to learn those concepts, like literacy concepts, mathematics concepts, whatever concepts are being used. They are more experienced in different language activities than the young learners, and they may gain more from feedback and negotiate meaning better. They are more efficient learners as they have acquired a wide range of strategies for learning already, and they are literate in their first language, which is a really real plus for the starting a little bit older. And they know better why they are learning an additional language and may be more purposeful in working towards their own objectives. So when we look at those, the age factor in language learning, it's basically each age brings its own advantages and disadvantages, and make use of the advantages of an age group when developing the curriculum and the materials. So when you develop materials for very young learners, you have to do that, make use of the things they do well. And then for a little bit older young learners, you have to make use of their advantages. Now I have another question for you. And that is, does transition need to take place to become a good user of another language? So let's vote on this question first, and I'll have to give the vote to you. Here it is. In order to become a good user of the language, you need to learn through it. So people are voting. 35% has voted, 45%. 60% of you have voted, 75% has voted, 85%, 90%. Okay, now it stops. So I'm going to close the vote, and I'm going to share it with you. And 80% of you says that's not true. You don't have to be transitioned into the other language. 78% says that's not true in order to become a good user of that language. So that's important to remember also when you look at your context. There is some interesting research, like the English proficiency test of 2013. Shows like in which country there is a very high proficiency of the English language, and the top 7 are the following countries. They are Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, Estonia, Denmark, Austria, and Finland. And these countries do not use English as medium of instruction in primary school. Most of secondary school, English is not used as a medium of instruction, or university. English is learned as a foreign language in these countries. So what does it say? You should not transition, or transition is not necessary? No, that's not necessarily what it's saying, but transition is quite helpful, as children will spend more time in the language and they have more exposure to the language. But you have to transition at the right time. If you do that too early, it's very detrimental to language learning and just learning in general. And I think there is enough research out there that shows that. So I'd like to take some time again to see if you have some questions or comments that you would like to add on this section? If you have some questions, you can type them in. I see someone said the slides are not transitioning. Okay. Okay. Chris is saying the key conditions for younger learners. Can you comment on how we might make use of these, ideal in contexts which are not favorable to them? That's a good question. I will come back to the teacher later on. Like, the teacher is very important in teaching the foreign language or the new language to young learners. If the teacher needs to have a good command of the language, and they need to be able to teach in a very interactive way. If children are taught in a very traditional way, it's not very effective for the young children. If you don't have the ideal context, how can you make them favorable? It's training, teacher training. And sometimes advocacy, lobbying to get a change going on. And if you can't change the conditions, we will look at it towards the end of the presentation. What is the best solution in the worst case scenario? And then Alison is saying, I think I misunderstood the last question. Is it possible to have a medium of instruction in 2 languages in the curriculum, isn't it? Yes, it is possible to have 2 languages as medium of instruction. Like in some situations, they will use the mother tongue for certain subjects. They use the additional language for some other subjects, and sometimes even a 3rd language for some other subjects. I will take some of your questions towards the end so that I can go through all my slides, and then we can still come back to this. The next topic I would like to look at is when can you use the second language as medium of instructions? And basically saying like, okay. So when do learners have sufficient command of the language so that it can be used as a medium of instruction? And often the way the question is phrased is, how much time do learners need to learn the other language well? Now, and the when is very difficult to express in time because of contextual factors. Do children need to learn the language for 1 year, for 2 years, for 3, 4, or even more? And it really, there is not an answer that can be given to it because it depends on the language level of the teacher, but also on the language distance between the first language and the second language. Depends on the motivation of the young learners. It also depends on the perceived value of the first and the second language. Say if the second language, the new language they are learning has a low value, children don't learn it as fast as when the second language has a higher value. There is some research there. I think I will touch on that later. The method used to teach the second language, the hours per week spent on language teaching and language learning, and also the exposure to the language outside the classroom. So is it a foreign language or is it a second language? And there are more factors that influence how much time children need to learn the language, but these are some of the main ones. So how then can you look at language learning then? When do you know that children have enough knowledge of the language that they can use it? So it's better to express the when in a threshold level. And I will explore 2 of those that are in use that we are looking at the moment. One is vocabulary size. What are important words to know and how many words are they? And then the other one is competences. What must the learner be able to do in the second language? And I first will look at vocabulary size. Of late, in applied linguistics, we have moved from looking at grammar to looking at vocabulary, as research has shown that the language threshold for reading, for example, is largely based on the vocabulary size of language users. And before successful reading can take place in the new language, sufficient knowledge of words in that language need to be present. And the question is, how many words do children need to know in order to read and write in the language well? Someone who has done a lot of research is Mr. Nation, and he says vocabulary size we often measure in word families, in which you have the base word and the inflected and derived form, and they count as one. So the assumption is that a word family is that when a learner knows at least one member of the family, they can well understand the other family members by using knowledge of the most common and regular words, of the English words, for example. But besides the base word or the word families, there are also studies that show that for English it's also important for children to learn the derivational morphology so that they are more successful. And it will also be the case for other languages where derivational morphology is very important. Now, when you look at like how large a vocabulary is necessary, like we know from reading that to be able to comprehend a written text well, you need to know at least 95% of the words. Now, we also know from English that a vocabulary of about 3,000 to 5,000 words is necessary for learners to read authentic text. An authentic text, that is text that is written for the cognitive level of the learners, but it's not adjusted to the language level of the learners. So it's not like simplified for the learners. And when you read a novel, and those are the novel for young adults, with reasonable ease, a learner needs to know about 5,000 words families in English. So those are quite a number of words that they need to know. And that's for English because vocabulary size is also language dependent. You can't say, okay, they need to know about 3,000 words in English, so they also need to know about 3,000 words in French. It doesn't work like that because languages are different. And they have different word lengths, and that affects the frequency calculations. And for agglutinative languages, languages that have a lot of morphology, the calculation also probably needs to include frequent morphemes. And there is some other research in languages that shows that for French, the children need to know about 2,200 frequent words, while in Greek it's the 3,350 frequent words that give a threshold level for becoming an independent user of the language. Now, at the early stage of language learning, the use of the language highly depends on the words that the children know. And so that's why it's important to teach the high-frequency words at the beginning. But also, looking at the academic words used in the classroom, that's quite important, because the high-frequency words are not necessarily also the words that the teacher directly used in the classroom. And for English and some of the other languages, there is a corpus of all the words in the language. Like for British English, it's the British National Corpus, or for American, you have the Open American National Corpus, for which you can start to look like what are the 1,000 most frequent words, and those words lists you can then look at also at your academic words you need in the classroom, and then determine what the words you need to teach the children earlier on. And also like what are the 3,000 most frequent words for English that children will need to learn. Some of the other languages, I've also found a corpus for them for French, Spanish and Portuguese. And if a corpus is not available for a language, like for Kiswahili or Amharic, you might need to analyze the textbook of the students, the teacher's guides, and other books that aim at the ages of the learners, that will give you an indication of the important words for the school setting, because we are teaching the language to be used in school to begin with. Now I've talked quite a bit again, so time for some interaction. A question for you. How many vocabulary do you think children can learn in a year, assuming they will have about 30 to 45 minutes a day of language learning? Let's see if I can give it to you. So, could you vote on that? Okay, so people are voting. 70% have voted, and 74%, so still some people are voting. I will close it in a few seconds. If you still want to vote, put your vote out. Okay, I'm going to close the polling and share the results with you. So you see that none of you thought that children can only learn 200 words in a year. 22% thought that they can learn about 500 words in a year. 33% thought they can learn 800. 25% thought they could learn 1,000 words in a year. And 90% of you thought they can learn 1,200 words in a year. Now there's also some research in how many words children can learn in a year. So in Indonesia and India, Nation had done some research, and he found that children had learned between 1,000 and 2,000 word families in 4 years. So that means that on average it's about 500 word families in a year. In Hungary, in Europe, they found that young learners learning English as a foreign language learned about almost 1,500 words in 4 years, and they averaged at about 4 words per contact hour. While Greece young students learned about 2,280 words in 4 years, which meant about 5 to 6 words per contact hours. So more research is necessary though, but what you see here is that if you aim for about 500 words in a year in settings like this, then you probably will be quite okay. So that's what we know about, or that's what I want to say for now about vocabulary as a threshold level. And I'm sure you do have some questions for clarifications, or you might want to add some comments that we can learn from. Okay, I see some of your questions coming in. It's let me read out some of the questions. What if the language children speak is a Creole or dialect, a trade language of English? There is no written form of the language and the grammar is different. For example, the trade language doesn't use the full range of to be. Yeah. So I think what you're talking about then is that what children are learning in the classroom is a different language, because the Creole or dialect is quite different from what is being taught in the classroom. I think those situations have been studied, and someone can probably help us with some research, and otherwise afterwards I might be able to send you some research about it. What about factors that affect number of words learned? That's a good question as well. Words need to be experienced by children at least 10 times, and so that means that it needs to come back quite often for children to really pick it up. And I haven't gone into pedagogy of how to teach vocabulary, but I can probably later on send you some research about it or some references that you can look up. Let me answer one more question. Someone says, doesn't it depend on the children's age? It will depend on the children's age, how many words they can pick up. And there is some research about young children learning words and some older children learning words. So that's where we can see that young children, like in formal education, they go a little bit slower with vocabulary pickup than the older children are. And I can also show you or share some research about that. There is some research about it. So I will leave the questions for now and see if I might be able to still get back to them at the end. And I will go on to the next part of the threshold, and that's let me see, I'm still struggling a little bit with the software here. And that is language competence as threshold. Because vocabulary is interesting, but vocabulary doesn't, just teaching vocabulary does not help children to function well in the new language. So when you look at the competence, you look at what learners have to be able to do in the new language. And in Europe, they have been working on a framework for competence levels in multilingual setting. And they call it the Common Framework of Reference for Languages. And it's widely used in Europe, and all the important language tests have been linked to it, like IELTS, the Cambridge exams, the TOEFL exams. They are all linked now to the Common Framework for Languages in Europe. And there are 6 levels. And the levels are expressed in A, B, and C. And A is a basic user, B is an independent user, C is the proficient user. And what we are looking at is the threshold level of B1, or the intermediate language user. It's at that level that the Common Framework recognizes that people are able to use the language independently, so they can learn through it. So when you look at how it is expressed there, they say they can understand the main points of clear standard input on familiar matters regularly encountered in work, school, and leisure. They can deal with most situations likely to arise while traveling in an area where a language is spoken. Produce simply connected text on topics that are familiar or of personal interest. They describe experiences and events, dreams, hopes, and ambitions, and briefly give reasons and explanations for opinions and plans. So these statements, you can see that if someone has reached this level, they are able to interact in a simple way in the new language. Now, in this was not very concrete yet, so they have worked on it and made them in can-do statements. And for example, for B1, the listening and speaking can-do statement, the overall one is, can understand instructions on classes and assignments given by a teacher or lecturer. Reading, can understand basic instructions and messages, for example, computer library catalogs with some help. And writing, can write down some information at a lecture if this is more or less dictated. So this looks at this is expressed in a higher level, more for university students, but so for primary school students, you will have to describe it in what you want the students to do in the new language. So what should they be able to do? And then you can determine a threshold level for competences for the learners. Now, there have also been some studies that have looked at the threshold level B1 and vocabulary size and say, okay, how do those two link together? And then it is shows very nicely that the threshold levels that were established for vocabulary go well with the competence levels. So, and the reference I can share later again, where you can see that. So the vocabulary size and competences give you a nice indication where you have to be with your students. So what you need to do is determine what competences are necessary for the learners when the second language is used as a medium of instructions. And these competences depend on when the second language is used as a medium of instruction. Because if you want to switch to the medium of instruction in year 4 in primary school, it's different from year 8. But so you need to look at it, but also depends that you need to look at the time you spend on it, because you need a number of words that children need to know. Yeah. And so the vocabulary size could be a guideline for when this is. So if you know that children learn about, in a normal setting, having about 30 to 45 minutes a day of language learning each day, they learn about 500 words in a year, and they need about 2,500 to 3,000 words to be able to function independently. Then you talk about 5 to 6 years before children reach that level. So that means when you develop the curriculum towards the threshold level, you really have to look for each year, what's the vocabulary that children are learning. You have to select the vocabulary very carefully. What are the most frequent words? What are the words, the school words that are necessary for the children to be able to function well in that language soon? What are the competencies you would like the children to have in year 1, in year 2, in year 3, in year 4, up to where you have reached the level of B1 of being an independent user of the language. So I will take some time again for some questions. Let's see. Let me see. Do you have some questions or additional comments on this topic? Let me see. These are still... There's a question here that says, are there any subcategory suggestions for vocabulary to learn, such as key functional questions? Yeah, I think like we could still go look more at, you know, what is important in vocabulary. You can like some formulaic phrases are also very helpful for the children in the beginning, and later on they need to be able to manipulate it. Yeah, and then someone writes, John writes, he says, most African learners come nowhere near to B1 in the second language. That's very true, and that's probably also why they don't do very well in education. And the ones who do better in their second language are much better in education.
I think, Agatha, there might have been some questions related to how children learn more words. Do they learn more words when they first start learning the L2, and does that decrease? Does their age matter, and does the teaching methodology also affect their ability to learn?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's yeah. It depends a little bit on the teaching methodology that is being used. But when you, like initially, it always looks as if children are learning more words than later on, because then they have to expand concepts of words and use them in different ways. And what you also see in some of the research coming out of Europe is that when children start very early in language learning and they have learned English, like it's often English that they experiment with, is for a few years, and in the third or the fourth year they get a bit bored and they don't want to learn so enthusiastically anymore. So then you have to adjust the methodology to keep them enthusiastic, and that's where the teacher becomes very important again. So here we have another question that says, doesn't methodology make a difference to good transitional language level, not just vocabulary? Yeah, that's like a lot of things work together. But like when you vocabulary might be a good indicator if children have learned enough like words to be able to function well in a new language. And how they are taught, that's also very important. But you need to have a certain knowledge of the language in order to transition well to the second language. And there are different approaches to do that. Like in Europe, they are also experimenting with content and language integrated learning, where some of the subjects are being taught in the new language, in English, for example. So the mathematics teacher is also is teaching it in English, but at the level of the learners, and he helps learners. He's very aware of that, and he helps the learners to learn more words as he is using English. But that requires quite a lot from the teacher to do that. So I would not necessarily recommend that for teachers that have not had very extensive teacher training. And Regine says, for real participation in the classroom settings, more than B1 level is necessary. And that's very true. B1 level, you have just become an independent user of the language, but it's still very difficult to express at deeper levels, and language teaching still has to continue and going on. And here is another question, a clarifying question. Do you mean that children have to master these words only orally, not to read them in order to reach the threshold? No, it's not orally, it's in all forms. So children will hear it, they might be able to see the word, they will read the words, they will have to use it and speak it and write it. And so it's the different exposures to the words, not only orally, and you can also learn new vocabulary reading. Or when you start to write a text and you need a word, you will start to look for the words as well. So there are different ways of learning vocabulary. Okay. I will move on to I think it's the last section. And just looking again at other factors that influence the when. And like when you look in the research, like how long does it take people to learn languages, like in similar situations, the difference between the two languages, the linguistic distance, is influencing how quickly or easily it is to learn the other language. So if the languages are quite close, then children or people tend to learn it more quickly than if the languages are farther apart. And then the interesting thing is like English or French, those two languages are very far linguistically from the languages in Africa and Asia, for example. So that always makes it takes a little bit longer. There are fewer cognates. The structure is very different. The sound system is very different. And also, if the second language, if the new language is used outside the classroom or not, that's very important. If the children only hear it in the classroom, it just takes longer than when it's also used outside the classroom. And again, the time per week spent on it. So the more time they spend on language learning, the better they learn it. Then I said before, the perceived value of the second language. there was one study that was done in Europe where they looked at children, one group of children learning English and the other one learning German, and they just about had fairly similar circumstances, but English was perceived as having a higher value, and all the children did better in learning English than in learning German. So we had a similar method, we had similar qualified teachers, we had similar circumstances, but it was just that English, the perceived value of English was higher, and it made children more motivated to learn it. And then the other one, it's a very important one, is the teacher. It's the language level of the teacher, the confidence of the teacher of using the language, and the attitude of the teacher towards teaching the language, and even the attitude of the teacher towards the language. And I'll just look at that a little bit more. What you see in research is that for a language teacher to do really well, the level of C1 is really desired of the Common European Framework. If the teacher has the level of B1, it is okay. But if the teacher has a higher level, the children do much better in the classroom. So given everything the same, if the language acquisition of the teacher is C1, the children perform better than when the teacher has a B1 level of the language. And how can you fix that? That's the question. How can you help teachers to become better users of the language? But really takes planning and time. Like the children need to take time to learn the language, and also the teacher. And it's not solved in a 2-week course or a 2-month course. It takes time to move to the next level. And in some countries there have been people have been looking at that and say, okay, how can we, as we are taking this time with the teachers, what can we do in between? So they have native speakers of the language coming in, like volunteer helpers. In Ethiopia, they've had many volunteers coming in, going to schools and helping the teacher. But there are just not enough volunteer native speakers to come out and help. Another solution has been the use of media, of television, radio, or cassette tapes, which is quite helpful, but it still requires electricity to be in the classroom. If the TV program is broadcast at a certain time, the children need to have access to the program at that time. So there's still many logistical issues there, and also sometimes accent issues. So if the sometimes children don't understand the native accent from the person on the TV. Well, if you have a native speaker in the classroom, they can adjust towards the children while the TV person is not adjusting towards the children. The other option is to train specialized language teachers, that language teachers go to the classes and teach the language rather than training all the primary school teachers to be very good language teachers. And in Taiwan, they had there is an example where they have English education military substitutes, and that all the young men who had studied abroad in an English language speaking country, they rather than going into the military service, they were obliged to go and to go to the rural areas and be a substitute teacher for the subject English. So that was another solution that was there. But it's, yeah, but what you can't expect very good outcomes if the teachers cannot speak the language well. So that's a real issue. Then there is another question that's often asked, like, can you use the first language during the second, during teaching the additional language? And some people say no, and others say yes, you can. And when you look at some of the research, it also say that initially it's a quite helpful resource for the children, but the teacher has to use it very strategically, and it needs to fade out. But what is happening with teachers who have low language skills, they tend to rely on the first language, and that doesn't help the children to move forward. So that's important to remember. So when are children ready to use the medium of instruction? Well, for school setting, that really depends on many things. It takes more time when the language level of the teacher is below level B2. It takes more time when it's a foreign language, when the perceived value of the second language is low, when the linguistic distance between the mother tongue and the new language is large, and when you start very young. Like young children learn very quickly, or they seem to learn very quickly, but it takes older children only very short time to catch up with what the young children have learned. There is some research about that. When does it take less time? When the language level of the teacher is at least B2, so C1 or more. When there are at least 60 minutes in a week of language learning, but the more time the better. When you start a little bit later, so when you start at 10 years old, you can teach the children in 1 or 2 years as much as when you started with very young learners. But you have the disadvantage of what I mentioned before, that they might be language anxious, and there are some other things there. When the value of the second language is very high, it goes a little bit faster, and when it's a second language, or when the exposure is more outside the classroom. So when you think about your context or what you are working in, you have to know what is the threshold for the vocabulary size in the language we are looking at. And when you are having one of the colonial languages as a medium of instruction, you can find some research about it. Also know the important frequent words of the additional language. Analyze the vocabulary the learners need to know in school. So if you want to go faster, be very specific about the school words that the children need to know, rather than the general words which are helpful for outside the classroom, but we need to look what they need to know inside the classroom. Analyze which competencies learners need to be able to learn through the second language. How much do they need to know in listening and speaking and reading and writing, and adapt the B1 threshold level of the Common European Framework based on what the learners need in your context. And then carefully design a program that purposefully teaches important words, vocabulary and competences necessary to use the additional language as a medium of instruction that takes into account your teacher's language level. That takes into account linguistic differences between the first language and the added language. So build your language lessons on the first language. Take into account whether the additional language is a second language or a foreign language, and how you give input for the language. Take into account the perceived value of the added language. If the added value is low, you might have to do more on motivation, so children stay motivated. And you have to monitor the development of the competencies and vocabulary in the language. Now, 2 last slides. So what is the best solution in the worst case scenario? That was one of the questions that was there. Well, that's develop a good program for the time that is given. Like if you only have 1 or 2 years to do the so-called transition, that's just not enough time. But you can't change the conditions sometimes, so try to do the best you can, base it on the first language. Link the second language reading to the first language reading, for example. Teach vocabulary based on what's really necessary in class, and teach some keywords and phrases. Monitor and measure, so have some kind of pilot program, some research, and then use that to advocate for another year or number of years of the use of the language, for example, in school if it's only 1 or 2 years. And often this can only be done small scale. But I have seen some places over the years. It might take years to get a change going on, but it's worthwhile to try. So what would be the best mother tongue-based multilingual education program? Well, it really depends. And when you look at all the research that is out there, you see that the successful foreign language learning can take place under different conditions and can be achieved in quite different ways. But there are a few key factors that you have to take into account. So that was the end of my presentation. And there's some time for questions about anything really on this topic. Let me look at your questions. This is, I don't know if you've ever done a webinar, but it's very quiet. You're just talking to your computer screen. And so it's lovely to see your questions coming. Let me see. Would you not agree that there are some efforts and contexts in which learners with low to ability at the switch of medium manage with good methodology, especially bilingual, to acquire both L2 and the L2 medium subject knowledge to a good extent? That's, I think in some contexts it will work, but I have not, I'm not sure if there are country-wide programs where that will work. Like here in Kenya, the children officially switch after 3 years of education, but at that point a lot of children have already dropped out and a lot of children just don't manage primary school very well. And some of the adults I've spoken with say, oh, but it was only after 5 or 6 years I started to understand the teacher. And then people are starting to catch up. So they have basically lost 4 or 5 years of education. Well, when the script of the mother tongue is different from the script of the L2, does the difficulty level increase? The difficulty level increases in reading and writing, not necessarily orally, because the script does not does not influence the oral language. So, but when children also have to learn a different script, that will take some more time. And then it also depends if the script is an alphabetic script or a syllabic script. So that will that's another factor that will influence how long it will take for children to learn to read well in the other language. Yeah. Will the PowerPoint be available for attendees? Yes, it will be available. Let me see. There is another question there.
Agata, there was a question earlier about what you meant between making a link between reading in the L1 and L2. What exactly did you mean by that?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. When to make a link between the first language and the second language. So when you teach children to read and write in the first language, and then when you teach them to read and write in the second language, it's easier for the children to learn first, look at the things that are the same. So when sounds and symbols are the same in the first language and the second language, that might be a good way to start to teach the second language. Say, okay, this is the sound B, and this is how we write the sound B in mother tongue, and this is how we write it in the new language. So then it's a very quick transition and transfer for the children to you might also have some cognates that you make use of, so words that are fairly similar or the same in both languages, and you might have some sentence structures that are the same, so that will help children to do the transfer, to gain some confidence, and then later on they will have to learn the things that look similar are different, and then things that are completely different. So for reading methodology, you might say it will be easiest for the children if you build the reading methodology of initial reading on their mother tongue, rather than have a general one that works in all the whole country. Let me see. Is there another question, Alison, that you have seen that would... I'm just reading through them now.
I think you've hit the main ones.
Okay.
If anybody has a question they feel we've missed, please retype it.
Okay. I can't see if people are typing.
I think a new one just came in, Agatha, asking about research that's been conducted in the U.S. showing that there are successful programs that are 50-50 in L1 and L2 rather than 90-10.
Yeah, so when you look at the US, you have a very different situation, like from situations like in Africa or in Asia, because I'm sure those successful programs are not American children learning Spanish, but it will always be children learning English. So that is the language that is surrounding by them. But I will have to look at the research, and then like what you have to do when you find research that shows a successful program is look at, okay, what made this a successful program? What is the context? What's the context of the teacher, of the classroom size, the motivation for the children to learn the language, the value of the second language, what is the motivation of the parents? And then you can say, okay, would this be applicable as well then to the context that I am looking at? I think that's just, it's very important to analyze successful programs and see to what extent they indeed could be transferred to another context that has similar or has a different context. What happens when the phonetic structures are different for L1 and L2? I'm not completely sure, Lipani, what you mean, but like children will have to learn the new sounds of the second language. The second language will always have new sounds from the first language, so children will have to learn that. When you look at the structure of the language, like the second language might also have different syllable structures, so children will have to get used to that as well in pronunciation, or when the syllable structure in one language is always open with a vowel, children will have to, and the second language has closed syllables as well, children will have to learn to pronounce words with closed syllables as well. So those are things you need to look at and help, and then and that's why it's nice when you can make use of the first language to teach the second language. Look at the things that are the same and take time to look at the things that are different and practice those a bit more. I'm just reading some of the questions here. Can students be taught in the medium of mother tongues of their classmates as additional language in multilingual classrooms? Okay, yeah, so that's the issue of multilingual classrooms. What do you do in the multilingual classrooms where there are different mother tongues? And you might not be able to use the mother tongue. So that, excuse me. When there is no common mother tongue amongst the children, you have to teach in the other language, but then it's very important that you take a lot of time to teach the other language that all the children need to know. And it's great for children to be recognized, that their own mother tongues are recognized, and children can learn to count in each other's languages. They can learn some words from each other's languages to make them appreciate each other's backgrounds and cultures. Yeah, teacher training and resources will be significantly different between the US and the developing context. That's very true. It'll also be between Europe as well. So when you are comparing successful programs in one context really understand what made that context successful, what made the program in that context successful, and are you able to transfer that program to another context where the contextual factors are different, then it will not be that successful. So when you are developing materials or when you are developing a program, you really need to look at what can the teachers handle, what kind of change can the teachers handle. Because if you make a huge change in how teachers should teach a language, then what they will do is they will use the materials which are supposed to be used in a new method, but they will teach them using their old habits, and then you will still not be successful. So, so if you have a major change in how a language is taught, you also need to have a very good training and follow up in the classroom. You need coaches in the classroom that help your teachers to really get used to the new method. One of your slides provided minimum inputs that must be present for a successful transition from the first language to the second. These inputs are often not available in developing situations. So what are cost-effective ways to mitigate these issues? Yeah, again, I would almost say if you have to invest on something, invest on the language level of the teacher that you put in the classroom to teach the second language. You have some research also from different contexts where teachers have been using with a textbook or with a methodology, and teachers who have not had a textbook. And when you have good teachers in both ways, you get a good outcome. But if you have weak teachers with a textbook, you get a weak outcome. If you have weak teachers without a textbook, you get a very weak outcome. So the teacher is very crucial here. And from your experience, what teacher training methods have been most effective in multilingual contexts? Teacher training is excuse me. It's really helping the teachers to use the methodology, and also make sure that the methodology is not very complex. So you have to think in simple, and also know what do the teachers know, what do the teachers already do in the classroom, and how can I make use of that when I develop a method. And then what's very hands-on training for the teachers, no lectures, but a short introduction of a method, and then let them practice in small groups, and then let them give feedback to each other. So that's what we have found is more effective than and having a small group of teachers at a time. And rather than having 120 teachers in one go, it's better to have 20 teachers and teach something, have them practice directly. Or if you have more teachers at the same time, like 100 or 120, make sure you have enough technical assistants to help you to monitor what the teachers are doing in the smaller groups when they practice. But really, so what is very effective, on what I've seen to be most effective, is that the teachers can use the method well when they leave the training. They need to have some understanding of why it is different, and it also comes during the course of the training, but just to explain to them how they should use it, demonstrate how it should be used, and then let them demonstrate it and practice using it. That I have seen as being very effective. Most effective, rather than a short training with a lot of talk and not so much practice. I see no new questions coming, Alison.
Great. Well, thank you, Ágata. If there aren't any other questions, we've come to our 90-minute time block for this. So thank you, everyone who participated. We can continue to have a discussion about this presentation through the MTB MLE website. We'll send out a forum link along with the PowerPoint, a place you can find the recording if you'd like to listen to portions again, or send it to a colleague or friend. And we'll also be providing some more detailed citations for the research that was cited. So thank you again to Ágata for her time putting this together and presenting from Kenya this evening. And thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you at another one of our events in the future.
Okay, thank you, Alison. Goodbye.
Goodbye.